I am going to tell you a story tonight, and I'm not going to tell you about statistics. I'm going to throw the statistic up on the wall because maybe you'll remember this, probably you won't. One person is forced to flee their home every 2 seconds. That's very dramatic. But this is very abstract because there is this saying that I like to quote, and that is, statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. And so as head of communications for UNHCR, and as Dirk said, responsible probably for the stories of 68.5 million people who've been forced to flee, my job is to tell the stories of individuals. And there was one story that kept me awake at night. There's one story that captured my heart so much, and I hope that it will capture yours too, and I'm going to tell it. And it's the story of Doa Al-Zamel. Doa is a young Syrian refugee girl. This was taken when she was 20 years old. But I'm going to start this story when she was 16, and she was growing up in a place called Dara. And I'm going to walk around a little bit because I see some of you are behind the pole. Dara, if any of you followed the Syria conflict, you'll remember this was the city that was really, the whole country was, the imagination of a lot of people was captured by the Arab Spring, the possibility of democratic change, of freedom of speech, of more human rights, of more civil society interaction. And so Doa, in her neighborhood, started seeing protesters out in the streets, holding signs, asking for freedom, asking for people to be released from jail, asking for relaxation of the emergency law in the country. And she was 16 then with her friends, to go out. She'd make signs in her apartment. She'd made beaded bracelets of the flag of the new Syria. And every day she went out and marched, and she felt this real strong kind of inspiration with all of them. What she didn't expect, because she was only 16, and probably, though, none of them expected, was that very soon after, her own government would be shooting at these peaceful protesters. What she didn't expect is that one day she would see tanks rolling into her beloved city and up into her neighborhood. And what she certainly didn't expect is that the scenes from her front window were going to start looking like this. One day, and this is in 2002 at the very beginning of, 2012 at the very beginning of the war. Her dad came home, and he was wheeling his bicycle, as he always did, but his head was down, and he parked his bike, and he came into the flat, and the whole family noticed that there were tears streaming down his eyes. And he said, my shop has been hit. He had a barber shop in the center of town, and it had been hit by a missile. And miraculously, he ended up, being able to survive it and escape. But that night, he and his wife, Hannah, had this discussion when the girls, Doa and her sisters, were asleep. And they said, they had heard rumors of young girls being kidnapped or taken away and never being seen again, being raped. And with the loss of his shop and his livelihood, he said, we have no choice but to flee. And the next day, they told Doa and her sisters, and soon they had packed up a car with one suitcase each and were headed across the border into Jordan. And they ended up, and this is a very long story short, with Doa looking over her shoulder back at her country and just hoping beyond hope that she would one day, be able to go back. But soon they were on this adventure that was not very fun. They were among the first wave of refugees that soon would become, today there are 5 million of them, Syrians in neighboring countries who would be forced to leave Syria and seek safety in a neighboring country. They knew somebody in Egypt, and they went to the town of Damyat, and they rented a rundown, cheap apartment like this where many refugees were living. That's her dad. And found actually at the beginning a hugely warm welcome from fellow Egyptians and neighbors. They were coming with food and with blankets and with clothing, and this was because the government policy at the time, and this was Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood government, had a policy of welcoming refugees from Syria. But very soon after their stay, there was a coup, and the current leader, Sisi, came into power and implicated all Syrian refugees with the former government. And soon the kind of friendly smiles as they walked down the street turned into either cold stares or no longer the warm welcome. And Doa was starting to, and her sisters were also starting to be harassed on the streets. She no longer felt comfortable. She was working a factory job and longing for Syria. She was Skyping with her friends or talking on whatever way possible on the phone, who were still back in Syria, and telling her parents she wanted to return home and fight the war, which they, of course, would have none of. And Doa was a very stubborn girl. Unlike her friends, she had no intention of getting married. She wanted to study. She wanted to become either a lawyer, but even maybe, a policeman or something that would, be standing for justice and human rights. One day, though, as she was taking the stairs up into her apartment, a young Syrian refugee man who was recently arrived and was staying with her cousin crossed by and spotted Doa. And for this young man, his name was Bassem, this was absolute love at first sight. He was just taken. He just looked at her face and was taken. She didn't even know it happened. And he went back up to his cousin's house and said, "Who is that girl?" And he said, "Oh, that's Doa, but she has no interest in any getting married. But her sisters." And he said, No, I want this girl. And Doa was, invited often, but she had zero interest. And he tried every trick in the book. And if you read the book that I wrote about the story, this love pursuit takes about 3 chapters because it's like Shakespearean. He tries, to give the sisters gifts. He totally befriends the mother so that he's almost like the son. He gets everyone in the family on his side rooting for him. But then he resorts to actually threatening to take and almost taking rat poison. And finally one day, he said to Doa, if I can't win your heart, I'm going to go back to Syria and become a martyr in this war. And somehow something switched when the prospect of him actually leaving and going back to the war, suddenly her heart opened up for him. And she fell in love. And this is Bassem. And this is Doa and Bassem doing some of their favorite activities, eating chips and drinking sodas and going to cafes, and soon they were a couple, and Bassem was working 2 jobs just to get by. He would come back to the apartment, the family apartment where she was living at night, and they would sit on the balcony drinking tea. And suddenly he started saying, "Doa, this is no life. You're working in a factory. I'm working in a coal mine. Let's go to Europe. We can get married. You can study, and I'll find a job." And he started showing her on Facebook, images of his friends, one who was in Amsterdam and who had found a job, another one who was in Munich, who was working, sending home, money home to his family. And Doa said, absolutely not. And Bassem, by the way, we would have to go on a boat in the water. And don't forget, I don't know how to swim. I almost drowned when I was 6. And she just simply refused. But then he started talking more and more to the smugglers. And the smugglers started promising, just give me your money, and we will, and showed them a picture of like a cruise liner, a nice, safe-looking ship that would take them all the way to Europe in safety. Doa didn't really quite believe that, but finally she gave in, and they gave up their life savings. She sold her jewelry, she sold her computer. He sold things, he got money from his brother, $2,500 each. And after 3 attempts, the third attempt, 2 attempts, they got arrested, spent time in jail. They were taken to this beach. This beach, we took the picture of this beach during the day. It was actually in the dead of the night. And they had been taken by bus to this remote beach where they were worried that the Coast Guard would spot them. When they got off, there were about 200 of them, fellow refugees. And hearing the smugglers shouting, run, 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 and Doa had to, go into the water for her first time and get onto a dinghy that took them out to a boat that looked like this. This isn't the exact boat, but Doa said that it looked very much like this, rusty and paint chipping and full already of 300 other refugees. And when she was pulled up onto the boat and went up into the top deck, they sat together shoulder to shoulder and feet to feet, and the boat smelled terrible. The toilets were overflowing, and people were impatient and crying, and children were whimpering. And she noticed that there were, people mostly from Syria, but also from Palestinians. This was 2014. There had been a bombing in Gaza, and people were fleeing, and some Egyptians and some Africans, and among them 100 children, including little Sandra, who was 6, and Masa, who was 18 months old. This is a picture that they had sent to their family in Sweden. The parents had sent and said, we're on our way. So to make a long story short of this trip in the boat, it was hellish. 4 days and 4 nights, and then after a couple of nights, Doa was despairing and saying, Bassem, I don't think we're going to make it. I have this premonition. And Bassem said, don't worry, Doa, I promise you we will make it to Europe. We're going to go to Sweden, and there all of our dreams will come true. On the 4th day in the water, the passengers collectively asked the captain how much longer until we reach Italy, the shores of Europe. And the captain turned to them and said, please just be patient a little while longer, 17 hours. 17 more hours, I estimate, and we'll reach the shores of Italy. And the sun started coming up, and all of the refugees above deck started breaking out in song, feeling very optimistic suddenly that this awful journey was going to end. But then Doa looked over her shoulder, and she saw a very menacing sight. Over in the distance, a boat was speeding towards them. And on that boat, when it got closer, she saw that there were 10 men holding sticks and demanding that they all disembark and get on to this even smaller and less seaworthy looking boat. And collectively, especially the parents, said, no, we're not going to do that. And they refused. They absolutely refused to get off. And the men started throwing sticks at them and shouting insults, but then turned around and sped away, and they all breathed a sigh of relief. Until just moments later, Doa looked over her shoulder and saw that they were coming back. And this time, they didn't speak. They just drove the boat into the side of Doa and Bassem's boat and started ramming a hole in the boat and shouting as the boat was sinking into the sea, let the fish eat your flesh, and laughing as the people below deck were just completely doomed. And meanwhile, Doa is holding on to the side and the edges of the boat and thinking, no, please not the water, please not drowning. And Bassam lost her grip from Bassam, who slid off the boat and into the sea. And Doa was holding on to the edge and saw on the side as a child got caught up in the propeller. And Bassam yelled, she heard her voice from Bassam down in the water and said, Doa, please let go or you're going to get caught in the propeller too. And she knew that she had to muster up all of her courage and release herself into the water, which she did. And she got caught under this plastic sheeting that had been used for shade from the sun and was holding on, and somebody was grabbing her hair who was drowning and trying to pull her down so that, they would be pulled up. And she pulled onto the plastic sheeting and pulled herself up into the water and started moving her arms and legs around, thinking maybe this is swimming. But luckily and miraculously, she saw Bassam swimming towards her with a child's floating ring that looked like this. The kind of rings that we use for toddlers in swimming pools and in calm seas. But Doa was a very petite 19-year-old, and she could easily slip over that floating ring and drape her arms and her legs over the side, and Bassam was treading water next to her. As I mentioned, everybody below deck was gone. There were about 100 survivors initially, people, crying for their loved ones, and everybody praying for rescue. But when a day went by and nobody came, people started to despair, and Doa and Bassam even saw as a man in the distance took off his life vest and just let the sea take hold of his life. It was on that second day that an old man started coming towards them, floating on a gas canister. And he had a little baby girl on his shoulder, wearing pink pajamas, and had just 2 teeth. And he said to Doa and Bassam, please take this little girl, take her as your own. I just lost 27 members of my family. I will not survive myself. And the old man handed the little whimpering girl to Doa, who put little Malik on her chest, and Malik settled down. She had a Quran right over her heart, and Malik lying there, and watched as the man left and drowned in the distance. And so then they were 3, Doa, Bassam, and little Malik. And I'm going to take a break right here in this story, and I'm going to come back to it and tell you what happened. But just to ask the question and to pull out to the big picture for a couple of minutes, to ask why refugees like Doa and Bassam take these kind of risks. Again, back to the statistics, that 1 in every 110 people on the planet has been forced to flee at this time in our lives. They get record numbers. Why? Because the wars that have driven so many people over the years from their homes have not found any resolution. So people are living in exile in developing countries that are overwhelmed, like in Egypt, where Doa and Bassam were, and are unable to restart their lives, feeling very frustrated. And this is what they flee from. This is a picture that I took in Homs in Syria, which was once a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the world's great gems. Utter destruction. In those streets, on that same day, I met this little boy, and he just looked at me matter-of-factly and said, and pointed to that missile, and he said, this missile killed my father. And so it's no wonder that people continue to flee. And I love to point to the people who ask, why are there so many refugees in the world, to this amazing poet from Somalia who wrote this poem, Home, and this is one line from it. It's because no one leaves their home unless home is the mouth of a shark. I really believe that if you think about it, if you think about your homes, how much you cherish them, your bedrooms, your bed, your kitchen, your family, your friends, the walk to your work, you wouldn't leave it unless you really had to. So people continue to flee inside their countries to other safer parts of the country or across borders. And UNHCR, my organization, continues to build either refugee camps like this one for them in the desert, or to support them in the cities and towns where they find themselves seeking exile. And in these cities and towns, much as you probably would not know if you read the press, I mean, I live in Europe, and I'm an American. If I read either the European press or the American press, you would think sometimes, or listen to the politicians, that all the world's refugees are in Europe or in the United States, or maybe in Australia. No. The fact is that most of the world's refugees, the vast majority, are in developing and poor countries. I think in Japan you wouldn't get that impression that they're all here in Japan, but in any case, it tends to be exaggerated. Public opinion tends to think that there are many, 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 many more in rich countries than there are in poor countries. And so this is a picture from 2015, and I'm sure you all read about this in the press. I know the Japanese press covered this as well. This was when the Syrian refugees, mostly Syrians, some Iraqis, some Afghans, decided enough of living in this exile misery. We want to restart our lives. We want to work. We want to put our children in school. And so they risked their lives again to take this very difficult journey across the Mediterranean Sea into Greece and up until Europe. They said maybe there is a welcoming place there, a more welcoming place. They had heard Angela Merkel's, or seen her tweet, and it went like wildfire. They had heard that Sweden was going to accept Syrian refugees and give them permanent status. And so they arrived. And they trudged across Europe through mud and rain. And initially, they received a very warm welcome. This is a picture I took in the city I live in, which is Vienna. I live there on the weekends. I work in Geneva at UNHCR headquarters. But I walked up to the train station that's in my neighborhood, and there were hundreds of citizens of Austria there to welcome the refugees who arrived at the train station. It was a beautiful moment in history, a moment of compassion, and you saw these scenes in football stadiums, in all kinds of reception centers and in city squares all across Europe. But as the people continued to come, this is a family who in Germany who took in Syrian refugees into their home, and many people did this and allowed Syrian refugees to live with them. But soon the scenes started to look like this. This is on the border of Hungary and Macedonia. Fences started to go up. It started with the Hungarian leader who began a narrative about the refugees that was completely distorted. He was saying that they were mostly men. In fact, they were mostly women and children. He was saying that they were all migrants coming to take jobs. In fact, the vast majority were fleeing from war. And he was, this narrative started a trend, and it started to spread, and we started seeing more and more scenes like this where governments were making decisions or trying to find ways to keep refugees out rather than to welcome them. And it went across, of course, across the ocean, and we know that also in America, very restrictive policies were adopted by the Trump administration, banning certain nationalities from coming, but also vastly reducing the numbers of refugees that it would resettle from 100,000 aspirationally to 25,000 today. So we're at a time where we have huge historical numbers of people forced to flee, but fewer and fewer countries who actually have the means welcoming them in the way that they used to. We have a serious, budget crunch at UNHCR, and we are seeing dwindling numbers of people getting refugee status in richer countries in the world. And we'll come back to that a little bit later with some messages, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about the situation in Japan a little bit when I finish, and also with our representative being here. So I wanted to just give you that and then bring you back to the story of Doa and Bassem. And you remember when I left you with that story, they were in the water on the floating ring. Bassem is treading water, and little Malik is on Doa's chest. There were fewer and fewer survivors. This is the end of the second day in the water. And Bassem started hallucinating and saying strange things, but then coming back and saying, Doa, I'm really sorry, I'm getting really weak, and I just don't know if I can make it. And she was gripping onto him and saying, Bassem, of course you can make it, just a little bit longer. I'm sure we'll be rescued. And he said, Doa, I am so sorry I put you in this situation. I have never loved anyone the way I love you. And Doa said, no, we will, I promise we'll make it. But she had to watch as the love of her life slipped from her grip and drowned before her eyes. And she would have probably gone down with him had it not been for little Malik on her chest. And she knew that she had this mission, which was to save this little girl to the extent that she could. And she overcame her sorrow and started singing to the girl. There was no food and no water. And on the third day in the water, and she probably looked like this. On the third day in the water, a mother approached Doa. This was the mother. Remember I showed you the photo of the two little children with the life jackets at the beginning? This was their mother, and she had with her Masa, 18-month-old Masa. And it was a very similar scenario with the old man. She came up to Doa and she said, Sandra has just lost her life, and my husband too. Please take Masa. I'm not going to make it either. And so all of a sudden, Doa was responsible for two children who were becoming very weak, two children who she had no food to give to, no water. At night, it was freezing cold. She rubbed their veins to try to keep them warm. She sang to them verses from nursery rhymes and the Quran, and just prayed for rescue, talked with some of the other survivors. On day four, imagine this, in the water, she was becoming really weak, but she knew she had to keep her grip on the babies. And she saw something in the sky which gave her hope, and it was an airplane that was flying by. And she raised her arms and shouted, rescue, and the other survivors, and at that time there were probably only about a dozen, had found plastic bottles to wave in the air. But then the plane went away and their hope was being lost. But that afternoon, as it was starting to get dark and there was a wind picking up and a feeling of a storm coming in the sky, they did see something that finally gave them hope, and it was this boat. And this is a merchant vessel. It's actually called the CPO Japan, but it wasn't from, you know how these vessels are flagged with certain nationalities, but it was a German company boat, actually. And it was taking chemicals to Gibraltar when it got a radio call. And the call came from Malta. And the radio call said, "There's been a refugee shipwreck. Here are the coordinates. Go there and see if you can rescue people." And so the captain of this ship changed course and went to where the shipwreck had occurred. And there was another merchant ship already at the scene. And the other ship radioed to him and said, "Don't bother. We were just out. We rescued the only remaining survivors. All you'll find will be corpses." But this captain said, "You know, I want to see for myself." And he ordered all the lights of the ship to be turned on and his men to go down in their lifeboat and search the seas. Sorry, that gives you away a little bit. So they heard this voice in the distance. It was Doa's voice. Doa was, as soon as she saw the boat, she was yelling, "Arab, Arab," which means, oh God," in Arabic. And this wind was picking up and it was blowing Doa's voice. So they kept going towards the voice, but the voice was somewhere else. And so it took them 2 hours to locate each other. And when they finally did, they were stunned to see that Doa had 2 little babies on her chest. And this frail young girl who they pulled up into the water. Doa tells me that she actually tried to push away and go drown with Bassem, but they said she was so weak. They just pulled her up into the rescue boat too. And this is the picture I just showed you of little Doa, little Masa and Malik rescued on the boat, recovering under these blankets. And Doa is also on the boat. And recovering in a separate room, and then a Greek helicopter came to pick them up. And when Doa is pulled up in this basket up into this helicopter, she was relieved to see little Masa there too, wrapped in a white blanket and being, held by one of the rescuers. But then she looked around and didn't see Malik, and she asked what had happened. "Where is Malik?" And she learned, unfortunately, that the little girl had drawn her last breath on the rescue boat. But the helicopter took them to the island of Crete. Doa was in such despair. That little girl, she'd become like her mother. Little Masa was taken to the pediatric hospital on the island of Crete. And the doctors said, because the press had learned that there was this little baby who had just been saved with this young woman, and the press had heard that there was this little girl, and the doctors came out and told everybody, "This girl, I'm sorry, she's on the edge of death. We're really not sure if she's going to survive." But they did everything they could medically, and I don't know if you've ever been to Greece and you met Greek people, but they're very, very warm people. And she had wonderful care. My colleagues from UNHCR in Athens, Arabic-speaking colleagues, flew down to Crete and were speaking words to her in Arabic. No one knew where she was from, but after a couple of days, little Masa pulled through. And this is Masa with her nurse in the hospital. And soon Doa was also recovering at another hospital in another city in Greece. And an Egyptian family took her in. And soon a number was published on Facebook. And messages started coming in and asking, "Doa, do you know what happened to my son? Doa, have you any word about my mother, my friend?" Doa had only, didn't know how to answer any of these because she didn't want to bear any of this bad news. But there was one message that came through that said, "Doa, I think that you saved my niece, Masa." And it had this photo. And it was from Masa's uncle, and the uncle that had been sent these photographs just before they were leaving. He was a refugee in Sweden, and he had arrived the year before, actually with Masa's older sister and his family. They had done this thing where they divided the family so because they knew the journey was so dangerous. And long story short, DNA tests, court cases, Masa has now been reunited with her uncle in Sweden, and she's thriving there, going to school, learning the language. And Doa received the highest honor in Greece. This is a picture of her at the Academy of Athens receiving this wonderful honor. And UNHCR, after 1 year of her being on Crete, was able to resettle Doa also to Sweden, the destination she was trying to get to with Bassem. We were able to resettle her also, very happy news, with her family. These are her younger siblings, because back in Egypt, Doa had given some press interviews and said there was mass murder on the Mediterranean Sea. 500 people died because another boat rammed. There needs to be an investigation. We need justice. And this press was published in Egypt, and the smugglers went to Doa's mother's and father's apartment, tracked them down, and started saying, "I know the names of your daughters," and was threatening them. And so with this threat, and this is one of the things that our organization can do, UNHCR was able to say this is a refugee family that really needs to get out of here. And we were able to talk to the government of Sweden. And on one day, in two different airplanes, one from Crete and one from Egypt, they ended up in this small, snowy village way north in Sweden, and are now recovering from their trauma, learning Swedish. This is Doa in her Swedish lessons, and enjoying a life. Since then, I wrote a book about Doa's story, which is called A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea. And I'm very pleased also to say that it's going to be turned into a film by Steven Spielberg and J.J. Abrams, who read the book and were so captivated by Doa's story. This is all wonderful news. Doa has been able to go on book tours with me. She has now become a public speaker. She's going to be an advisor to the film. But I have to ask, why do refugees like Doa and Bassem have to resort to these kinds of smuggler boats? Why isn't there a massive resettlement program? Maybe just for the Syrian refugees to start, the worst refugee crisis of our time. Why aren't there more legal pathways for students, refugee students, to study, to find work permits? Why isn't there more international support for the neighboring countries that are hosting so many refugees? And finally, why isn't more being done to stop the wars and the persecution that is driving so many people from their homes? Because until those changes happen, people will continue to flee. And one thing is for sure, nobody fleeing war or persecution deserves to die trying to reach the safety of another country. And another thing is for sure, no one would be on those boats if they could find safety in a future where they are. So there's one piece of good news that I would like to leave you with. We are about to see the adoption of a very important new international document, and the government of Japan is going to be one of the signatories. And this is going to happen at the United Nations in December, and it's called the Global Compact on Refugees. This global compact will address a lot of these problems if it is implemented that I just laid out. For example, the neighboring countries who are hosting so many refugees will get much more support, international support, in particular in the area of development. So they'll have roads built, infrastructure built, there'll be economic stimulation in exchange for allowing refugees to work, in exchange for allowing refugee children to go to school. There'll be a pledge that governments, the richer countries of the world, need to take their own share of refugees as global responsibility sharing. And there will also be a pledge to really, invest in organizations like UNHCR and involve the private sector more. So hopefully there's a better future for refugees like Doa, and on behalf of Doa and little Masa, I would like to ask that we all join together and try to work towards a world in which every life matters. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. I'm very inspired by your speech, and I'm a student from Hosei University, and you showed me the picture of refugees waiting in front of the wall in Hungary, and I think some countries start to refuse accepting refugees, and how would you confront to this problem as UN? What's your organization's name?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think one important thing to know is that there is an international convention that was adopted in 1951. It's known because of that as the 1951 Refugee Convention. And most of the countries in the world have signed it. And if those signatories to the convention are in a way, violating the convention or doing, there's no punishment really, but at least we have this document as a kind of also we can use it as a moral voice and to say, look, and you'll have the press saying, oh, is this a violation of the convention, et cetera, et cetera. So most countries want to be, to live up to whatever they signed on to. Unfortunately, there are some that are showing that they don't really care. So then it makes it very difficult for UNHCR. We have negotiations with their authorities. We usually have an office in that country that works very hard to try to get these policies changed. We speak out publicly when we find that's strategic and wise. We get other countries to also put on pressure, maybe to change. So, and again, back to this global compact on refugees that is about to be adopted, this document actually reaffirms all of the what's laid out in the convention, which means that basically every human being fleeing war or persecution has the right to seek asylum in another country, and those countries cannot turn them back and also cannot return them to situations of danger. So yeah, it's not an easy answer to that question, but at least we do have this international convention to point to.
I'm from J4U. I'm responsible for fundraising by telemarketing. So my question is almost of her, but as you may know, Japan is aging society. So the most of our donors, Japanese individual donors, are over 50 years old. So of course, the young Japanese people are very emphasized with the crisis of the refugees. They are so kind and they are very nice, but they don't make donation for us. That is a problem. So I want to know what is the most efficient way to appeal for young Japanese people and push their back to make donation. And I want to know how to develop the donation society in Japan.
Yeah, to be totally honest, I'm not an expert on fundraising, so more communications, but I do think that we all have the challenge of capturing the imagination of young people. I do think that when young people hear about refugees, they care even more deeply than some older people maybe feel like they've seen it all. I find when I meet with young people, they get very moved. I think it's really important that we find out, where young people get their information here in Japan, what kind of, pop stars are they attracted by? I mean, to have these kind of, maybe celebrity supporters or sports supporters, that people they can identify with, inspiring them to do things. I think that works in a lot of other countries. I really do think that the presence of the Refugee Olympic team in 2020 here at the Tokyo Olympics, as well as the Paralympic team, it's going to be extremely inspiring to young people, because these are young people who are competing. They have amazing stories. I think when Yusra Mardini came here, she inspired a lot of people, but it's going to be right here in Tokyo, and there's going to be a lot of press about the Refugee Olympic team. So I think it's going to make your lives easier, because you're going to have this really positive narrative around refugees to speak to young people about, because they're going to have incredible backstories. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I feel like I have to do something for refugees. But also I think at the same time it's important to stop the war to prevent the refugee crisis. So my question is, I don't know if it's the right question to ask you, but what can we as citizens, what can we do to prevent the war, stop the war, or improve the bad political situation in the country? What can we do? Or all we can do is just helping refugees? What can we do?
That's an extremely important question, and there were times, if you look back a little bit in history, way before your time, but maybe in the 60s, and where there were youth-led peace movements that did have an influence on politics. So absolutely, young people can, on university campuses and whatever, can demand an end to wars, an end to, countries' involvement in wars. So I do think there are things that you can do. Even just informing yourself and having discussions, it goes a long way. And you're right. I mean, we at UNHCR we are there to help the victims of war. If you support the United Nations as well and get involved in the United Nations, there is the part of the United Nations where Japan is also an active member that is there to prevent and stop conflicts. Our former High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, is now the Secretary General of the United Nations, and his top priority is the prevention of conflicts. It's not an easy job because you have to have the member states all on board to do it. But I do think, if the world showed, if citizens of the world showed that they care about peace, then the governments would maybe follow suit, I hope. Thank you very much for that question, though.